adjectives, all of these adjectives that you would learn about yourself. I wouldn't have believed it. Like, what does it mean to say you're streaming now? I don't know what we would have thought that meant in rabbinic school. My favorite was at our grandson's bar mitzvah, which was 2 weeks ago, this Saturday. We were out in Pennsylvania, and they belonged to the conservative congregation. I was the rabbi at the Reform congregation there for 13 years, so we know a lot of people. And the service was in the synagogue, but pretty much it was a by invitation kind of thing. There were like 50 people there and of course they were streaming. They weren't streaming because they either don't have the money or they aren't sophisticated to stream. They were on Zoom, which means that there was a laptop sitting next to the reading stand on Zoom. And as we sit down, there's it's pretty quiet, right? There's only 50 of us in a room like this big. But what's usually happening at services? People talking to each other. And you hear it coming through the speaker through Zoom. At which point the rabbi says something that I never would have believed a rabbi would be saying, which is, would you please mute yourself? And of course, they didn't do it. And so periodically you'd hear things like, look at that suit. He's wearing that suit. And of course, or he's talking too quietly. I can't understand anything he says. Why is that person? What's wrong with that kid? It's too fast. And that's what's coming. All the things that you hear at a bar mitzvah if you're sitting next to the person who can't stop talking, right? That place, every synagogue, yeah, including this one, has somebody at every service who can't stop talking. Okay, well, we could hear it all coming through the speakers, and the rabbi keeps trying to say nicely, would you please mute yourself? And then we hear, I don't know how to do that. He says, look to the bottom left of your screen. You'll see a little microphone. Tap it. And it was like, this is like a stand-up routine that... Okay, so usually in this time, when I used to do this on a regular basis, and they were paying me to do it, you were paying me to do it, we would talk about Israel, since that seemed to be a subject that everybody wanted to hear us talk about, and we sort of Simone and I had a perspective that maybe not everybody had. But Carol already beat you to the punch, and she asked me to do this at the opening Brotherhood brunch. At least she asked me to talk there, and that's what I said I would talk about. So when is that, the third or fourth? Third. Okay, so I decided not to do that and to do something entirely different. We'll see whether you find this interesting or not. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Okay, I think that, Lonnie, would you pass these out? I think that there's 15 of them. So if a couple of you would share, it'll make it a whole lot easier if I don't have to read this text out loud completely, if you can see the text. Because what I want to do is to talk about a biblical story that you may know something about, or you may not know something about. If you grew up with the same kind of Jewish education I grew up with, you won't know anything about it. Because certainly I did not know anything from the book of Judges. I only pass these out now because I knew that as soon as you get them, you have to read them. And it won't be really clear what I'm trying to do here until we do this together. So you can resist the temptation to read it if that's in your makeup. Okay, so while Lonnie is finishing that, let me remind you back to Rosh Hashanah. We were not here Rosh Hashanah, but I imagine on Rosh Hashanah you heard the story of the Akedah. Correct? You heard the story of the binding of Isaac. Because that is such a popular story that even though in the tradition you read the binding of Isaac on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, and you read about the birth of Isaac on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, And if you think about that, what the rabbis were trying to do was to talk about birth on the new year. And what comes when you finish reading about the birth of Isaac? What's the next thing that happens? Is the binding of Isaac. I think they just didn't want to roll the Torah scroll. And that's why the binding of Isaac is on the second day. There wasn't a whole lot more to it than that. But that story is so challenging theologically, so challenging sociologically, psychologically, on every single level, from a family dynamics point of view, from a parental point of view, that it became the beloved story, not the birth of Isaac. And so the Reform movement 200 plus years ago decided, when it decided on only one day of Rosh Hashanah, that we'll read that story rather than the birth of Isaac. And then that just enhanced its credentials. So I just want to start by reminding us a little bit about the end of that story. You see where it says Genesis 22? Finally, they came to the place of which God had told them. Abraham built an altar there. He laid on the wood. He tied up Isaac. He laid him on the altar. He reached for the knife. But an angel of the Lord called to him from the heavens, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he answered. And the angel said, "Do not raise your hand against the boy." Right? As Abraham looked up, his eyes fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Hence, what do we blow on Rosh Hashanah? A ram's horn, although usually they aren't. Usually they come from some other animal, and actually that's, as long as it's from a kosher animal that's not a cow, it's perfectly okay. But that's where the whole thing of the shofar comes from, right? And Abraham named that place the Eternal One sees. As it is said, on the mountain of the Eternal there is vision. And the angel of the Eternal One called to Abraham out of heaven a second time and said, "I swear by the Eternal One that because you have done this, which is not to withhold your son, I will bless you greatly and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the heaven and the sands of the seashore." Right? We all know that. We know that story almost by heart. Right? Okay. And what's, in Hebrew we say the nimshal. What's the conclusion that we draw from that? This is the mashal, the story. What do we draw from the story? The nimshal. What do we get from it? At a minimum, what do Jews not believe in? Child sacrifice. Actually, we take it a step further and we say human sacrifice. Absolutely, that's our tradition. We read this every year. Just look at Abraham and Isaac. We do not believe in human sacrifice. We sort of slide over that God required it in the first place. And Abraham was going to do it. You know, and that this is a little boy. I know the Midrash that he was really 37 years old. And that's based on a piece of logical reasoning from the Bible, which I won't bore you with right now. But even if he was 37 years old, Abraham was going to do it. And Isaac was willing to let him do it. Okay, but it doesn't happen at the end. So we know we don't believe in human sacrifice. That's for heathen. That's for pagans. Jews aren't like that. Israelites aren't like that. Hebrew aren't like that. Okay, we ready for Judges 11? Who's ever looked at this before? Has anybody looked at this? Of course you have. There you go. Judges, first of all, the book of Judges is a very, very interesting book. If you haven't read it, the book of Judges and the book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, these are really, really interesting books. They're worth your time just to sit down and read them and try to see what's there. This is the pre-monarchy part of Israel. Remember, under Judges, this is when there's a kind of confederation of tribes, of Israelite tribes in the land of Israel, and they're threatened by various enemies. The big one is the Philistines eventually, but it could be the Edomites, and it could be the Amorites, and it could be the Ammonites, and some other ites. And what happens? They look for, we were talking about this a minute ago, they look for a charismatic individual. In this case, Jephthah, who is described as a mighty man, the kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger of his time. And they rally around this impromptu general who defeats the enemy. And then the story will end, but there was no king in Israel. Meaning, it's pretty clear there's going to be a king in Israel. Okay? To deal with these kind of things. So Judges 11 is about this guy Jephthah, Who's heard of him, apart from you? You've heard of him? Okay, Yiftach is his name in Hebrew, which is sort of hard to say. Yiftach, which would be translated something like, he will open, or he's an open book. Something like that. Okay, he is a Gileadite, which means what? He comes from the area known as Gilead. Okay? But we're going to see that his father's name is Gilead also. All right, anyway. So Jephthah, the Gileadite, was an able warrior who was the son of a prostitute. Dun, dun, dun. Jephthah's father was Gilead, but Gilead also had sons by his wife. And when the wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out. They said to him, "You shall have no share in our father's property, for you are the son of an outsider." They were being nice. You see, some things never change. Right? Doesn't this just sound like as the world turns? Days of our lives. So Jephthah fled from his brothers and settled in the Tov country. Now this is an area named Tov. What does Tov mean? So you want to sort of pay attention to all this. This guy who's an open book is in the Tov country. Right? Men of low character gathered around Jephthah and went out raiding with him. So who is he? What is he? He's a bandit. Why is he a bandit? Because he's making a living. His family has exiled him without anything, but he's this tough guy. Sort of rascals gather around him, form a gang, a band, and they're out raiding. Sometime later, the Ammonites went to war against Israel. And when Ammonites attacked Israel, the elders of Gilead went to bring Jephthah back from the Tov country. They said to Jephthah, "Come be our chief so that we can fight the Ammonites." Oh, they need him now. Oh, it doesn't matter your mother was a prostitute now. We need you. Jephthah replied to the elders of Gilead, "You are the very people who rejected me and drove me out of my father's house. How can you come to me now when you are in trouble?" The elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "Honestly, we have now turned back to you. If you come with us and fight the Ammonites, you shall be our commander over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, "Very well, if you bring me back to fight the Ammonites and the Lord delivers me to them, I am to be your commander." In other words, what does he say? I'm holding you to this. You want me to come back? Then I'm in charge when I come back. And the elders of Gilead answered Jephthah, "The Lord himself shall be witness between us. We will do just as you have said." Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him their commander-in-chief. And Jephthah repeated all these terms before the Lord at Mitzpah. By the way, you want to keep these straight. Mitzpah is not Mitzpeh. And we've been to Mitzpah recently. It's where there's a medieval kind of shrine built by the Crusaders to the prophet Samuel. Many scholars and archaeologists think that's Mitzpah. What do you guess? It's about 10 miles outside of Jerusalem? Yeah. So Jephthah then sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites, saying, "What have you against me that you have come to make war in my country?" The king of the Ammonites replied to Jephthah's messengers, "When Israel came out of Egypt, they seized the land which is mine, from the Arnon to the Yabok, as far as the Jordan. Now then, restore it peaceably." What is their claim? That the Israelites have taken some of their land, and now they're just taking it back. Again, things never change. Jephthah again sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites, and he said to them, Israel did not seize the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites. When they left Egypt, Israel traveled through the wilderness of the Sea of Reeds and went on to Kadesh. Israel then sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, "Allow us to cross your country," but the king of Edom would not consent. They also sent mission to the king of Moab, and he refused. So Israel, after staying at Kadesh, traveled on through the wilderness, skirting the land of Edom and the land of Moab. They kept to the east of the land of Moab. Autocorrect. Anyway, they kept to the east of the land of Moab until they encamped on the other side of the Arnon. And since Moab ends at the Arnon, they never entered Moabite territory. In other words, what's his reply? We didn't do it. And by the way, that's what the Bible says. If you read that stuff about them coming out of Egypt, and it all culminates in the Torah portion about what's his name? Who's hired to curse the Israelites, and he ends up blessing them. Bilam. Matovu alecha Yaakov. I can remember it in Hebrew. Mishkanotecha Yisrael. Okay? So he's just saying, no, we didn't do that. Then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Ammonites, the king of Heshbon. Israel said to him, "Allow us to cross your country." But Sihon would not trust Israel to pass. Sihon mustered his troops, and they encamped at Yahaz and engaged Israel in battle. But God was with Israel and delivered Sihon and all his troops into the Israel's hands, and they defeated them, and Israel took possession of all the land of the Amorites, not Ammonites, Amorites, the inhabitants of the land. Thus they possessed all the territory of the Amorites from the Arnon to the Abok and from the wilderness to the Jordan. Now then, the Lord, the God of Israel, dispossessed the Amorites before his people Israel, and should you try to possess that land? This was never yours, he said. This was the Amorites, not the Ammonites, which we won fair and square. We had God on our side, but they attacked, we won. Again, this should sound familiar. Okay. Do you not hold that Chemosh your God gives you to what? Do you not hold what Chemosh your God gives you to possess? So we hold on everything that the Lord our God has given us to possess. Okay? This is all background. Now we're getting to what I really wanted to get to. Are we ready? All right. While Israel, let's see. Anyway, the king of the Amorites paid no heed to the message that Jephthah sent him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He marched through Gilead and Manasseh, passing Mitzpeh, that's different than Mitzpah, of Gilead, and from Mitzpeh of Gilead he crossed over to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made the following vow to the Lord. Please pay attention. If you deliver the Ammonites into my hands, then whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me on my safe return from the Ammonites shall be the Lord, and shall be offered by me as a burnt offering. Did you ever hear of this? The Jews did this kind of thing? You did? Think about it. It's pretty hard to find another example in the Bible where somebody makes this kind of indiscriminate vow. Think about that. Whatever comes through the door, I'm going to sacrifice if I win. Pretty intemperate, don't you think? Not too smart. Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites and attacked them, and the Lord delivered them into his hands. He utterly routed them from a place called Aroer. It's hard to get that out of this English. But Aroer, as far as Minit, 20 towns, all the way to Abel Cheramim. All the Ammonites submitted to the Israelites. So now you know this is the big finish, right? When Jephthah arrived at his home in Mitzpah, there was his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrel and dance. She was an only child. He had no other son or daughter. On seeing her, he rent his clothes and said, "Alas, daughter, you have brought me low. You have become my troubler, for I have uttered a vow to the Lord, and I cannot retract." "Father," she said, being the good little girl she was, "you have uttered a vow to the Lord. Do to me as you have vowed, seeing that the Lord has vindicated you against your enemies, the Ammonites." She further said to her father, "Let this be done for me. Let me be for 2 months, and I will go with my companions and lament upon the hills, and there bewail my maidenhood," which in more direct English is my virginity. "Go," he replied. He let her go for 2 months, and she and her companions went and bewailed her maidenhood upon the hills. After 2 months' time, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. She had never known a man. So it became a custom in Israel for the maidens of Israel to go every year for 4 days in a year and chant dirges for the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. I would like the women here to raise their hands if you've ever observed that practice. Anybody here been out bewailing virginity anytime recently? Is this part of Jewish custom, of Jewish tradition? Have you ever heard of such a thing? Apparently it was. Because the whole story may have been told to explain why Jews were doing that. That happens in the Bible a lot, where you get a whole story, and at the end, they did this and this, and now we know why they do this and this. So, what, that you were bewailing your virginity? How young? How young were you? Anyway, sort of stepped on my timing there, Joe. It would have been funnier. Anyway, think about this for a second. Before we look at the commentary, and in Jewish tradition, it is always a mistake, always, to read the Bible without the commentary. Because Judaism is not, you've heard me say this a million times, but I'm going to say it again. Judaism is not what the Bible says. Simone's closing her eyes. She's heard this so many times. Judaism is not what the Bible says. Judaism is what the commentators, what Judaism says the Bible says. Right? Just like Christianity is not what the Bible says. Christianity is what, given Christian traditions, say the Bible says. That's why you have, what did Rod used to tell me? 57 kinds of Baptists. And I used to tell him, you're confusing Baptists with the ketchup. But anyway, but he said really that they all have a different interpretation of these key texts, and they think theirs is the Christian interpretation, the correct one. The same thing applies for all religions. I don't know Hindu texts, but I'm sure it's true for them. Or Sikh texts, or Muslim texts. You know, for sure that's the big dispute between the Shia and the Sunni, right? Is how they read certain key texts. All right, the same thing is true here. We're not going to want to just read the story on its own. But what do you think of this story on its own? It's a good story. It's an interesting story. It has an interesting hero, a guy who's an outsider, who has been rejected by his community, who is then called by his community to save his community, and he responds, fine, I will do it, but I get to be in charge, but he does save his community. He could have just walked away and said, what do I care about you? I'm fine as an individual. Right? What do I need you for? And why should I risk myself for you? What is the demand of a community upon me? Again, a very contemporary issue. Yes. All right, so we'll get to that. I promise we'll get to that. Joe always has to get ahead of the game. All right, but we'll get to that. You're absolutely correct. But what I want you to see here, look, let me tell you, if we had gotten to Beckley, West Virginia this year, I was going to tell them a rabbinic story, a little bitty rabbinic story. And the little bitty rabbinic story is that there are several people in a rowboat, and they're out at sea. They're in a kind of boat out at sea. And one of them, this, by the way, is found in Leviticus Rabbah. If any of you want to check, it's in the big book of Midrash on the book of Leviticus. One of them takes out a drill and starts drilling a hole under his seat in the boat. And the other people in the boat say, what are you doing? They're jumping all over him. They're screaming at him. What are you doing? You're drilling a hole under the boat. We're all going to drown. And what does he say? It's my seat. It's under my seat. What do you care? Now, this is already 2,000 years ago in the book of Leviticus. In Leviticus Rabbah. It's one of the earliest versions of Midrash in the Bible. And the rabbis already understood that there was a potential conflict between somebody who puts the individual first and everybody who puts the community first. And we're living that now. I think that little story says everything. Does that person have a right to drill a hole under his seat since it's his seat? Even if it endangers everybody else. Okay, so Jephthah could have said that. He could have said, you threw me out, I'm done. He doesn't say that. Okay, now what about this vow? All right, so we know that in Genesis, it doesn't go through. So why isn't there an angel of the Lord that calls out, Yiftach, Yiftach, Jephthah, Jephthah, do not send that knife forward. Do not, don't touch him. Now that I know you're willing, why doesn't that happen? No, okay, so maybe that's it. We should, the Reformed Judaism is about recapturing old things and starting them again. And, the entire staff here are women. So I think you should be talking to them about creating these 4 days. What? No, that's the point, Lonnie. Nobody's ever done it. But I could just see a program. Can't you just see it in the tablet? Women only, 4 days bewailing virginity up at, I don't know, what's the highest point around here? Okay, so the vow seems a little problematic, right? What you should know, and I think Joel does know this, is that the rabbis hate vows. Any and all vows, they hate. And the Bible allows for vows. There's vows all the way through the Bible. But the rabbis feel 613 commandments with all the embellishments that we're doing as rabbis is more than enough. You do not need to add to it with vows. So they don't like the Nazir, for example. Do you know who the Nazir is? This is the person who takes a vow and then he can't touch anybody that's dead. And Samson is said to have been a Nazir because he lets his hair grow and he doesn't drink any wine. And it's an attempt to elevate oneself in holiness. And the rabbis it's there in the Bible. They can't get rid of it. It's in the Torah, not just in the Bible. But they don't like it. They don't like vows because to them it seems piling on. It seems like what Judaism isn't good enough for you. You have to add to it. You have to make yourself stand out and be special. Okay, so what I brought you are a couple of commentaries of what the rabbis do with this story. And my favorite is actually the first one. I should have saved it to last, but I wanted to make sure we got to it, so it's the first one. It's from Bereshit Rabbah, yes? So it's a great point. Did everybody hear Joel? The reason I'm asking that is I'm not impugning your hearing, but I can barely understand through the face mask, which is why I wanted no one to sit in the first 2 rows so that I could wander around up here and not worry that I was contaminating anybody. His question is about Kol Nidre, right? We call this, the big night of the year, certainly the most awesome service of the year in the literal sense of the word awesome, not the teenager use of the word. And isn't it all about annulling vows? And isn't it about vows? Kol Nidre, all vows. That's what the words mean in Aramaic. Well, the first tip-off for you, Joel, is that this is in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. So what does it tell you when there's a prayer in the prayer book that's in Aramaic and not in Hebrew? It was a popular prayer, not that its origin, its source, came up out of the people. So Kaddish is another example of that. Right? The rabbis really didn't like Kol Nidre at all. And Kol Nidre is a relatively recent phenomenon, right? Some people date it to the end of the 15th century, and the whole business of the Inquisition in Spain. It might be a little older than that. It might be a little younger than that. There are different versions of it. They've come into the tradition. The version we have asks that our inappropriate vows from this year to next year be annulled. There are old versions of Kol Nidre that ask our vows from this year back last year be annulled. But that left Jews open to criticism, particularly in disputations with Catholics and other religionists, that you couldn't trust anything a Jew said because as soon as he got to the next Yom Kippur, he was going to annul it. So what did they do? They made it forward instead of retroactive, so that it was not annulling anything that you said in the previous year. My point about this is, even though we have made it into the thing, it wasn't always the thing, to use Tina's words, to quote her from last night. It wasn't always the thing. And indeed, I would argue most people don't even know what the words mean nor care. They only care about the music. And that's because the music taps in to the emotional spirit of the day. Da 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 da. Right? It's all about that. It could be, Mary had a little lamb, and it wouldn't matter because it's the music. Actually, it would matter because we know the English, and therefore the words would get in the way. But as long as they're in Aramaic, they don't mean anything to us. The words are irrelevant. All that matters is the music. I'll stand by that, in my view. I think in almost all worship, there are three things that matter in worship. You know what they are? Music, music, and music. Those are the three things that matter, in my view. Which is why I think Tina hit it right on the head this morning when she contrasted saying the Shema with Courtney singing the Shema. The food. The flute. I don't know what you mean, the food afterwards. For the food. That's true. Okay. Okay. Yeah, this is a theme with Aaron. Aaron went with Simone and I to Israel in spite of the food. Comes to services in spite of the music, right? Okay. All right, so let's look at this Bereshit Rabbah. Bereshit Rabbah is the big book of Midrash on Genesis. Also a very old Midrash. It's a great book. There's all sorts of great stuff in here once you've been taught how to read it, because it requires some technical information to read it. But let's look at this. Eliezer. Who's Eliezer? To cut to the chase. You remember Abraham had a servant whose name was Eliezer. Eliezer said inappropriately. Remember Abraham sends him to find a wife for Isaac? According to this Midrash, Eliezer said inappropriately, "Let the maiden to whom I said, 'Please lower your jar that I may drink,' and who replies, 'Drink, and I will also water your camels,' let her be the one whom you have decreed for your servant Isaac." You remember that kind of vow? What are the rabbis saying? This was a dumb thing to say. Yes, we know it's in Genesis. Yes, it's part of a beloved story about getting Isaac a wife who apparently was too slow or too unable to find a wife on his own. And when Rebecca sees him for the first time, she falls off her camel. So, who knows? I'm just saying, who knows? But nevertheless, that's a beloved story, but still the rabbis are saying that was dumb. Why? Had some servant girl come out and given him water, would he have married her off to his master's son? What if she was an inappropriate woman? Would he still have done it? Nevertheless, God ensured that he received the appropriate response. In other words, God thought this was a dumb thing to say anyway, but God wanted the right thing to happen, and so God took care of it in spite of Eliezer's idiocy. Does that make sense? Okay. Jephthah said, we just read this, "Whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me on my safe return from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's and shall be consecrated to God, and I will offer it as a burnt offering." And the rabbi said, even if it was a donkey or a dog or a cat, which of course you can't sacrifice, right? You can only sacrifice certain animals that the Torah prescribes. No dogs or cats. No donkeys. Although in the early days of the state of Israel, when you could buy a hamburger at a place called Wimpy's, that's how they pronounced it, Wimpy's, the rumor used to be that it was really all donkey. Because there weren't very many cows in Israel then, but who knows? No donkey, dog, or cat came out. He would have offered it as a sacrifice, and God caused this time an inappropriate outcome. When Jephthah arrived at his home, there was his daughter coming out to meet him. In other words, what's this interpretation say? God is punishing Jephthah. You say stupid vows, sometimes God fixes them for you. But other times, God doesn't. Beware. Watch what you say. Don't take on vows that are stupid. Actually, they would have said, don't take on vows. They're all stupid. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan, one of the great rabbis, and Reish Lakish, who, by the way, was a convert. Just if you're curious. Reish Lakish was what are these people? Who are those people? I'm forgetting all of my English. A gladiator, there's the word. He was probably a gladiator. He was definitely a highwayman before he gets religion. Literally, Jewish religion, but before he gets it. Okay? And many times in the Midrash it says, Amar Reish Lakish, which is Reish Lakish said. But when you're a beginning rabbinic student and you don't know a lot of Hebrew, you usually make this mistake. Amar Reish Lakish, which you could translate as Reish said to Kish. And unfortunately, this happens a lot in Hebrew classes, and it usually evokes great derision. Anyway, so Yochanan and Reish Lakish disagreed. Rabbi Yochanan said that Jephthah owed the monetary equivalent as fulfillment of his vow. Where do we know that? In the Torah, it says an eye for an eye. What did the rabbi say about an eye for an eye? Lex talionis. The value of an eye. That all this is about monetary compensation. It was their interpretation of those critical passages. And Yochanan says the same thing here. Yes, he made the vow, but it doesn't mean he had to sacrifice her. He just had to pay to the temple the equivalent in money. Reish Lakish said, and here's your point, Joel, he owed nothing. For the Mishnah teaches a person who dedicates a non-kosher animal or an animal with a blemish as a sacrifice has said nothing. There was no vow because the vow was meaningless. To say, I'll sacrifice anything that comes through the door, meant he would have had to likely sacrifice something that's not kosher, like his daughter. So therefore, it was nonsense. It was not a vow. Don't you like that legal move? Sure you can, but what he is saying is it's the equivalent of saying nothing. In other words, when he took a vow that was contrary to Torah law, he was saying nothing. So therefore, it was nothing. Look at the hoops that the rabbis just jumped through to fix this story. Either he owed money or he owed nothing, but what was he not supposed to do? He was not supposed to sacrifice his daughter. How do we know that? Because Jews do not sacrifice their children, at least not literally. Right? Okay. So let's look a little further. And furthermore, and was not Pinchas not alive then to annul this vow? You remember Pinchas? Not a very savory character, not one we like. He was the high priest of his time. He was the zealot that runs through the Israelite with his non-Israelite companion when they were cohabitating, and he stands up for God. Remember, he runs them through with a spear, and he's given the gift of an eternal covenant of peace from God as a result. Generally, in Reformed congregations, we don't read that part of the Torah. We sort of skip right over it, but it's there. And so as the high priest, he was the Supreme Court of his time, and why didn't they just go to him and have the vow annulled? A third strategy. It's a real vow. It's not about money, but it could be annulled, and we have the person on the scene to do it. Why not? Again, I urge you to pay attention. Pinchas said, the high priest, He needs me. I should go to him? Jephthah, the man in charge, the general, the mighty man, said, I am the chief captain of the Israelites. I should go to Pinchas? Between this haughty person and that haughty person, the young woman was lost. I think that there's a big lesson there. Pinchas isn't going to do his job. Pinchas is not going to do what's necessary because it would mean appearing to be subservient to Jephthah. Jephthah is not going to get out of the stupidity of what he said, even at the risk of losing his own, not just his daughter, but his only child. Because he is not willing to appear to be subservient to the high priest. And so nobody does nothing. And how do they end up? With her sacrificed. Over nothing. The point, the reason I love this midrash is it first lays out the problem and says sometimes God fixes it for us. That's to set it up. Then says sometimes God doesn't fix this for us. By the way, we have rabbinic teaching that says he should have paid money to the temple, not sacrificed her. By the way, he said a vow counter to Torah law, so therefore it was nothing. But even if you don't accept A and you don't accept B, Pinchas was around to resolve the problem. But the two of them couldn't get together because both of them had too much pride. I don't think it's just stubbornness. I think it's pride, which still is the issue today. Linda. I spent a career working in synagogues, trying to negotiate sometimes the difference between my position and other people's position, sometimes the difference between one person's position and another person's position. There really should be a required course at Hebrew Union College in politics, because there is no more political environment than a synagogue or church congregation. And I think that there should also be some sort of course that I call whip and chair, which is like a lion tamer, where you sometimes just have to sort of try to get people in line. There's nobody like this here. Why doesn't somebody step up and say, where's Pinchas? Or somebody step up and say to Jephthah, you're going to let your daughter die because you won't go talk to Pinchas? What's wrong with you? There's nobody there willing to say anything because, after all, one's the high priest and the other is the top general, the top secular authority, if you will, and nobody is willing. I can't believe that there was nobody who didn't see it, but nobody is willing to speak truth to power. Okay, but the Midrash chooses not to tell us that. So we can speculate on that. That would make the story a little softer. Lonnie. Dangerous. No, Chabad would recognize the Midrash, and I'm pretty certain that Nachum and Gel would not disagree with anything I just said. As long as I stay away from talking about Haredim and ultra-Orthodox, I'm pretty sure he would not disagree with anything that I just said. You can ask him, though. He's a smart guy, and he would probably have some interesting things to say. Let's look on page 4, because we only got a few minutes. I'll be happy to stick around and answer questions, but I don't want to keep, you're spending a lot of time here today. And so let's look at the Babylonian Talmud. This is in Tractate Ta'anit, which is the tractate on fasts. So that shouldn't be a surprise. It is written, they have built shrines to Baal, to put their children to the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, which I never commanded, never decreed, and which never came to my mind. Now, are we familiar with what we're talking about here? That in those middle books of the Bible, we find out that part of the worship of Baal was to sacrifice children. In Gates of Repentance, that made an appearance in one of the readings. I don't know if it's in this book or not, because I don't mean that joking. I just don't know. I'm not familiar with this book to know what they included. Anyway, I never commanded is a reference to the son of King Mesha of Moab, as it is written, he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him up on the wall as a burnt offering. I never decreed is a reference to Jephthah's daughter. It never came to my mind is a reference to Isaac, the son of Abraham. What is the Talmud telling us? At a minimum, what someone said is Abraham misheard. Know that the whole business, according to this little passage, Abraham taking Isaac to be sacrificed, that we started with 45 minutes ago, and this complicated, troubling, but interesting, provocative story is all a mistake. Because God doesn't ask for child sacrifice, whether it's the Babylonians to their god Baal, or it's Jephthah offering up his daughter, or it's Abraham offering up Isaac. It causes us to read that story entirely differently, as the entire story is a mistake. See, I think when I've had this opinion for a long time based on other midrashim and other teachings, particularly from one of my teachers, Norman Cohen, which is that when God says to Abraham, take your only son and sacrifice him, Abraham is supposed to say, are you high? No. I am not doing that. That's what God wanted. God wanted Abraham to behave just as he had behaved at Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm going to destroy the whole town. No, that's not fair, God. You're a God of righteousness. There might be 100 righteous people there. You start with 50. There might be 50 righteous people there, then 40, then 30, then 20, then 10. In other words, Abraham makes an effort to save Sodom and Gomorrah, the worst places on earth. But when God says to him, kill your own son, nothing. Moreover, before that, when Sarah told Abraham to kick out Hagar and Ishmael, does Abraham argue? Does he do anything? He kicks them out. It's almost as if God said, well, if you were going to do that with Ishmael, let's see what you'll do with Isaac. This is a very powerful statement. It says these may be stories in the Bible, but we're supposed to read them within a context that tells us we don't do this. Right. At least for the good ones in the midst of the evil people. And if you think about it, this is not an unusual dichotomy. People who are one person in public and another person at home. Who have one set of values in public and for the public good. Who do not necessarily live by those same values at home. Right? These stories so astound me because they are so close. They are so real to our lives. It doesn't matter how many centuries apart we are. And all these are the issues of what it means to be human. Somebody else have a question before I go on to the next guy? David Kimke, we're going to look at. So if you want to know when he's from 1160 to 1235. After some technical commentary, this is me. I didn't want to take the time to write it all out or try to explain it. Based on the letter Vav, it has to do with parsing a word by looking at its prefixes and its suffixes and drawing conclusion about certain meanings because of those prefixes and suffixes. And the vav is a prefix here that he felt showed Jephthah's vow was actually an either-or vow. He thought that what Jephthah really said by carefully reading the Hebrew, namely his vow was, if it is not an item that may be offered as a burnt offering, it will be consecrated to God, or I will offer it. In other words, if it is something that can be offered to God, I will offer it. And if it's not something that can be offered to God, then I won't. That's what he thinks Jephthah said. You like that little move? Yeah, but that leaves things open for a lot of interpretation. Okay? So it seems that the verse in the continuation that Jephthah did not kill her, for she said, right? Remember, she's not appropriate to offer, so therefore he couldn't have offered her if it's an either-or vow. And what did she say? She said, I will bewail my virginity. She did not say, I will bewail the loss of my life. Wouldn't she have said, I'm going to go cry for the loss of my life if she was about to be sacrificed? What? Coyotes? Is that what you... This shows that he did not kill her. However, she never knew a man. Furthermore, when the text said he did to her as he had vowed, it does not say he offered her up as a burnt offering. Why doesn't it just say he offered her up? Why does it say he did as he had vowed? Because the vow was an either-or vow. So he was actually living up to the vow. This proves that she was secluded as a hermit. The words he did to her what he had vowed means that she was consecrated to God by living in the woods by herself. I guess she got to bewail her virginity every day. Now, who's Levi ben Gershon, 1288 to 1344? He makes more or less the same point. The commentators all read the earlier commentators, and they would sort of add to what they said. Jephthah presumably constructed for her a house away from where the others live, where she saw no people, not even women. She just lived there by herself. But first, he waited 2 months for her to go off to the mountains with her female friends to bewail her virginity. And at the end of that time, he closed her up in the house. She saw no one there, not even other women, except for 4 days each year when there was a custom for Israelites that women would go to bewail their virginity with Jephthah's daughter. But she was separated from men from all of her life. Does this make you feel better? What it does do is it emphasizes he didn't sacrifice her. However, she had to be dedicated to God because of his vow, and so what that meant was to live in seclusion with all the horrors of that, except for the 4 days of year when her female friends could visit her. Exactly right. Exactly right. We have to remember that all these commentaries were written by men. It comes through right there. Okay, so I want to do one more, and then we'll wrap it up. I included this one because I just thought it was hilarious. Don Isaac, either it's pronounced Abravanel, Barbanel. This is a name that you may still hear. There used to be a commentator on NPR. It was a woman whose name was Abarbanel. This is a big-time name in Sephardic Jewry, Abarbanel. So he was a biggie, 1437 to 1508. After making more or less the same points, he adds, I think it is from this story that the nation of Edom, who's the nation of Edom? We know in Jewish tradition, Edom stands for Rome. And Rome ultimately stands for Christianity, right? Because it's the center of Christianity. So that the nation of Christianity learned to make houses of seclusion called cloisters for women who enter there and never leave for all their lives and never see another man as long as they live. Some of you may remember In My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Remember that movie? No? Is it too old? Remember that the bride's father believes everything good that ever came into the world, or every kind of idea, all was Greek. Well, Jews are the same way. You see, so this guy has to explain what a nunnery is. And obviously, they got the idea from Jephthah and his daughter. Where else could they have gotten it? So he's living, 16th century, 15th, the beginning of the 16th century, Spain, and he wants to claim that this basic idea, holy orders, in Catholicism, really all comes from this interpretation through the rabbis of what Jephthah did with his daughters. It's obviously absurd on his face, but it's just sort of funny to me how you can get the kind of pride in your tradition that leads you to assert things like this that obviously are wrong. And Windex, right? But the Midrash itself, the Midrash from Genesis Rabbah, I think really says it all about what we should take from this story. Be careful what we say. Don't let pride get in the way of correcting a problem. And we do not believe in any kind of human sacrifice, let alone child sacrifice. Okay, who has a question or a comment or something for a couple minutes? Did everybody hear what Aaron said? Aaron said, Jephthah says, we have this land because our God gave it to us. You have that land because your God gave it to you, which seems to set up an equivalency, right? Do we think Jephthah really thought that? Right. Well, in other words, you could read it the way you did it, and maybe that is exactly what Jephthah thought. Because in the period of the Judges, the notion of monotheism, the way we have that notion, certainly was not prevalent. However, it also could have been that he was trying to be diplomatic and say to this king, what is the justification for you being on your land? Of course, it said your God gave it to you. So how can you deny our justification for being on our land when our God gave it to us? And probably that was a persuasive argument given the suppositions that king would be working from. So if you want to draw that lesson from it, Jephthah seems to have been somebody who had a kind of subtle ability to think, which makes the vow all the more stupid. Right? I saw another hand someplace. Joel? Bonnie, you're next. Okay. Right. So theologically, Jacob's vow is pretty problematic. You remember the famous scene where he's running away from Esau. He stops for the night at what ultimately becomes Bethel, and he makes some rocks as a pillow, and he has a dream of the ladder. And when he wakes up, he says this thing. It's usually called a prayer. But he says this thing where, oh, now I see what's going on. You know, I see where I am, that this is the gate to heaven. And I'll tell you what, God, if you take care of me on this trip, then you can be my God. And I'll be your worshiper. What a deal. It is pretty obnoxious. But nobody is at risk, unlike Jephthah's vow, where it turns out his daughter was at risk. Okay. Who's the other hands that I see? You'd have to show me exactly where it says that. There are plenty of places in the High Holiday liturgy where we reference Isaac. Now, why do we reference Isaac? because he was willing to die in order to do what was necessary for what would be the Jewish people. God commanded Abraham to do this. And so we like to think that in Jewish life, we always talk directly to God, that we have no intermediaries. It's one of the big things that we like to draw as a distinction between us and Christianity, who talks to God through the personhood of Jesus. Well, this is an example of talking to God through the personhood of Isaac. And the parallel between Isaac and Jesus is not only maintained in Judaism, it's maintained in Christianity. They see this parallel also. And what is happening here is, look, if we don't have enough merit for you to listen to us, God, we're the progeny of Isaac. Who could have more merit than Isaac? Not Abraham. Isaac, who was willing to be sacrificed. And so the High Holiday liturgy likes to use Isaac as a motif because we're appealing to God to grant us forgiveness, to accept our atonement, even though we're undeserving. And so, right, isn't that the theme over and over again? And so Isaac stands in for us. God, you like him. Look what he did. Forgive us because of him. Which is a version of what you find in Christianity. Obviously, they developed it far more, far further down the road. But almost nothing in Christianity has no counterpart in Judaism, and almost nothing in Judaism has no counterpart in Christianity. It's really just a matter of emphasis and how something develops. Who else? Has everybody got all of their questions resolved? You wanted to say something? How can you say that? Okay, what Lonnie said is Isaac was against all of the ritual stuff. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, so I would just be guessing. I'd have to see what you were talking about to know. But the notion that, look, there is a medieval text called The Last Trial. It's a long poem. It's a kind of epic poem. Who wrote it? I can't remember. I should remember. Anyway, Simone will look it up. So she'll, that's the thing today about smartphones. You don't have to remember anything. It's all there. Anyway, in The Last Trial, Abraham succeeds in this poem. Isaac is actually sacrificed. This is a Jewish text. And not only is Isaac sacrificed, he's resurrected. Wow. Jewish text where Isaac is sacrificed and resurrected. And why is he resurrected? To atone for our sins. Woo. Did I actually say that in a sanctuary? Really? In a synagogue on Yom Kippur? Really, it's all there. Well, it's true that in Christianity they often see Isaac as a forerunner of Jesus. Not just Isaac, but this is a big piece because they emphasize on that sacrifice of Isaac, the near or the completed sacrifice of Isaac. And in Jesus' case, he is also sacrificed for all of us. So there's, as I said, there's very little in Christianity that doesn't have some sort of something there in its root, which is in Judaism. Who? Shalom Spiegel. Shalom Spiegel. And when I first encountered this in rabbinic school, it blew me away. It was like, wow, this runs counter to everything that they told me in religious school. Where everything in religious schools, this is Jewish, this is Christian. Never the twain shall meet. There's no middle ground here. This is Jewish, this is Christian. And the problem is, it actually doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up. There is plenty that differentiates Judaism from Christianity. We don't have to exaggerate it to the point that there's nothing in common. And all religions are interested in repentance. All religions are interested in sin. All religions are interested in atonement and how we achieve atonement. And so we shouldn't be surprised at all, particularly given that Christianity grows out of Jewish biblical tradition, that there are these common things. Right? Yes? I'm saying that in those prayers, that's the mechanism of the prayer. We call upon Isaac because we think Isaac is the appropriate channel. Exactly right. That's why I love that passage. That's why I included that passage, because it should encourage you now to read the Akedah entirely differently. Okay? Judy? To my knowledge, I can say this as a fact for me, just talking about me. I have never read an interpretation of the Akedah that settles all my questions, that answers everything. In other words, if it answers A, B, C, D, and F, then there's G, and that it doesn't answer. And if it answers G, H, I, then it didn't answer A, B, C, and D, because it's such a weird story that it seems to defy the ability to put it entirely together coherently, to get all the details of it together coherently. Which means, this is why I love that story, you have to emphasize some part. And when you choose what part you're going to emphasize, that's the path you're on now to how you're going to understand that story. That's really a sophisticated, interesting story. If that's over and over again, I said this while I was rabbi here, that pediatric Judaism, the Golden Book version of Judaism, is a disservice to everybody, because that's what the Golden Book does. It takes every story and simplifies it so there's one simple, clear, and usually irrelevant meaning. Only in a real sophisticated story that's got all these different moving parts to it, and probably was put together over time, which is why it has different pieces that don't all fit together, do you get the possibility of having your thought jog to the point where every single year you can read that story and see something different in it. I'm 71. Every single year you can read that story and see something different in it. There aren't a lot of stories that you can do that with. But the Bible, particularly the book of Genesis, is really full of them. Agree. Anybody else? I keep people scratching their head or adjusting their masks, and I'm not sure if you want to say something. If not, I appreciate you listening to me for the last hour, and I guess that we start in 10 minutes. Thank you.